Safeguard our flank. Part 8. The village of Hebuterne. Behind the 56th Division was the beautiful village of Hebuterne. The capital of the area was Amiens, where the cathedral declared the region's religious obedience. The land was described as chalkland, and Hebuterne was one of the area's largest towns. A few cottages lined the road, with tall stately trees, behind which lay orchards and gardens. Amongst these trees the French, the previous occupants, had constructed a number of trenches. The place was typical of the region. All the buildings were built of red sand brick, except the church, which was of imported stone. The main employer in the village had been the owner of the brick-built mill. Its ruins and cellars now formed the battalion headquarters, with all the usual staff, adjutant, RSM, clerks, runners, signallers and cooks, etc. The entrances were protected by sandbagged abutments. The French had also constructed trenches on the eastern side of the village closest to Gomcourt Wood, using the number of interconnecting communication trenches to give access for supply teams during the hours of darkness. Nearby was a bunker known as the Keep. The village nestles between the British Third and Fourth Armies, opposite the salient village of Gomcourt. Its chateau, park, wood, famous tree the Kaiser oak, and crossroads. In parts of the front line the German trenches were only 50 feet away, with a hedge in between. The Germans could be heard talking to each other. By the time the British occupied their front line in 1916, Hebuterne was deserted, a ghost town, a shadow of its former past, for it was in ruins. Even though the village and the church had suffered terribly, the tower still stood proudly silhouetted against the sky. As with all points of interest, the Germans had the church entrance well within artillery range, and zeroed in. Even though the entrance had been sandbagged, it was still a very dangerous place to linger. By standing at the Hebuterne crossroads, looking a mile north, you could see the village of Gomcourt with its cemetery and park. Between Hebuterne and Gomcourt stood a hedge, interspersed with a few trees which lay in a coombe, a slight valley at an angle to the rise. And this is where an advanced trench was to be prepared. The attack at the Gomcourt salient was to be a diversionary one to delay or stop German reinforcements backing up their troops being made by the main British thrust up the road, the main supply route from Albert towards Bapaume. This big push was to be made by the British Fourth Army, led by General Rawlinson, backed up and supported by the reserve army of Sir Herbert Gough, whom it was hoped would exploit the penetration by creating a rout in the German rear. From the centre of the main British attack, Gomcourt is some 10 miles north. The salient sticks out into the British sector, was an eye-catching bulge you couldn't help but be drawn to. Gomcourt is on a slight rise, dominating the countryside around. The trees in the park had been stripped of all their foliage by shell fire, making the place ghostly, possessed by evil. It is the village, the park and cemetery which are contained within the Kern Redoubt, whose administration centre was the Quadrilateral, a fortified box formed by tracks on all sides. The German front-line trench outlines the geographical spur and the village complex. Behind the line, the D6 road from Fonqueville, south of Sierre, the coombe between the two chalk banks held no man's land. The crucifix on the British front line stood on the shoulder of the valley. As with all German-held villages situated on their front line, the buildings became fortified strongpoints, making this a very strong fortified position. In front of the German trench line stood barbed wire strung on iron stakes in a series of rows. The wire made the position impregnable. The German front-line trench was serviced with support and guard lines, all linked to the communication trenches, which stretched far back to the central fortress. The German front line was a deep trench, well riveted, bearing a parapet. It was dug 12 to 15 feet deep, shored up at intervals with timbering and wickerwork. Along its length it was further strengthened by reinforced bomb-proof shelters. Cut into the rear of the German trench were deep dugouts, some served with their own periscopes on a tripod. It was the job of the observation squads to inform their colleagues if an attack was being made. A number of tunnels and cut-ins led back to the new third trench. One in particular led back from the Z on the D6 road, the Staffordshire's front, which was to be of such importance, contributing to the German counter-attack. When the alarm was raised by the German observers, their shout triggered a timed response of 3 minutes. Their machine gun teams assembled their weapons for rapid fire. It was these machine gun teams and supporting artillery that were the chief danger to both advancing divisions. They were placed where they would do most damage, having a clear field of fire, each situated where they could enfilade the area to their front. The German artillery parks of all calibers were hidden in the woods behind Gommecourt. They were of equal, if not superior in number, to their British counterparts. Forming the hub of all this was the command centre at the Quadrilateral. The whole salient dented the British sector, and the Germans had the time and the inclination to make themselves as comfortable and as impregnable as possible. The German 170th Reserve defended this fort. They wanted to survive and see another day. Part of the German defence was to set up their machine guns so that they could sweep their front and cross over and cover the next gun along the line. At night, each gun was set up on fixed lines to cover a particular weak spot or gap in the wire. The gun could be discharged at irregular moments throughout the night, dissuading nightly patrols, capture and repair parties. Against the Germans were pitted the 46th and the 56th Divisions. They were going to be asked to walk across no man's land, in line, evenly spaced apart, whilst trying not to bunch up or take shelter. If they could keep pace with the advancing barrage, they were assured the Germans were not going to stand up on their firing steps, but were going to keep their heads down. This creeping barrage was there to force the enemy to keep below their parapet. As there had been an almost continuous gunfire for the previous week, planned to destroy the banks of staked barbed wire and gun nests, taking the redoubt was not going to present a problem, they thought. This was the considered belief at British headquarters. Others, less knowledgeable, thought this show was going to be a total walkover. 2 days before the attack, patrols reported that there were great gaps in the German wire, and some of the German positions had been vacated. On the 46th Division's front, patrols reported there were no gaps, and that there was a large unreported hollow in the ground that was half filled with barbed wire